I'm Pastor Aaron from the Bride in LaPorte, the Bride Church. And it's always my privilege, always my pleasure to be here. It really is an honor just to get to share some things with you during this time. And I hope and pray that it's really beneficial for everybody who is a part of this. A lot of wonderful things going on in this place. It's wonderful that we get to share these things online as well. And tonight we are going to talk about temptation, okay, that's a big topic. And I guess it might seem like a really obvious topic when dealing with addiction recovery, but a very necessary one for us to always keep in the forefront of our minds. Because the one thing that I'm assured of, I'm certain of this, is that you're going to encounter temptation. You've probably already encountered temptation today, and you will probably encounter temptation tonight before you go to bed. We are going to be encountered by temptation. And so I want to get into what the Bible says about temptation, why we are tempted, where does it really come from, and how do we beat it? You know, and this is something the Bible actually says a great deal about. So I have a whole bunch of different verses, just like little nuggets. I'm going to put this stuff out there, and you guys can do with it what you want to do with it. But I hope that it really speaks to you and that you allow it just to sink in and to really think about what this is saying. And I'm going to start in James chapter 1. The book of James chapter 1 and verse 12. And we're going to read a few verses there, but I'm going to stop and talk about it along the way. James 1 verse 12 says, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation. For when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him." That's like an action-packed verse. There's a lot of stuff that's going on there. But it says, blessed is the man who endures temptation. Now, I want you to think about that, just what it means exactly to be blessed. We don't often look at temptation. Temptation is a form of suffering, particularly if you say no to it. If you give in to temptation, well, then I guess it's not a form of suffering. But temptation in and of itself, when you're under the pressure of that, when you come face to face, you know, with something that's a real temptation that you're like, man, I know how destructive this is. I know how bad this is for me. I know this is gonna let people, all the consequences run through your head, and yet there's this desire to do it. And when you suffer that trial, when you suffer that temptation, and you make it out the other side, there's a promise of blessing. And what it really means to be blessed is to have joy. Now, none of us think about joy when we're going through the midst of temptation. We're like, this is the worst. You know, I hate going through this kind of temptation. I wish I never had to deal with it again. But there can be a blessing on the other side of it. So again, I want to encourage you. I want you to have hope tonight. That it might be really hard right now. You might be in the trenches. You might be fighting a battle that's very real. But there's hope. And there's a promise from God of blessing on the other side of that temptation, not only in the here and now, but in eternity. It says, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. There is a great blessing in overcoming temptation. God promises the crown of life to those who endure. There are 12 different crowns mentioned in the scriptures, and people make charts and things, and that's nice. We're not going to get into all of that tonight. But the one mentioned here is the crown of life. And I'm quite certain it represents honor, because a crown always represents some form of honor or like authority, right? So it's like honor, salvation, eternal life. He's going to grant the crown of life to those who endured temptation. And then, really interestingly, if you carefully look at that verse, so it talks about the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. The motivation for enduring temptation is to be love. That's something to think about that. And when I say you need to let this stuff sink in, let that one sink in. That the motivation for enduring temptation, the motivation for saying no, from this biblical perspective, the motivation ought to be love and a love for God in particular. And it's interesting to think of love as a motivator to overcome temptation. I think it may in fact be the best motivator for overcoming temptation. A lot of times our motivation to say no to temptation, it stems from pain. It stems from fear. It stems from coercion. You know, if you get into some legal trouble, you may have some hoops to jump through, right? And in that instance, you're sort of being coerced to stay on the right track. There's this exterior threat that can kind of motivate you. And that kind of thing can work for a little while, but as soon as that threat's removed, so's your motivation. It's gone. But if your motivation is a motivation of love, that's a motivation that can endure. And you can think about this in so many different ways. And you know, certainly it applies to a love for God, but I even think in regard to our own families, in regard to our friends, in regard to our relationships, and so many different things that out of a love for other people that are in my life, this can manifest this kind of motivation, this drive that wasn't there. So, man, I don't want to lose these people. I don't want to hurt these people. I'm tired of wronging my friends and all this different things. And then ultimately the supreme love is a love for God. And I go, wow, to really think about that when we face temptation. Say, man, where's that motivation going to come from? How about a place of love? Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. He doesn't say sing really loud in church if you love me. He doesn't even necessarily, say to do a whole host of different things. He doesn't just say, well, just say it. He says, if you really love me, then there's a lifestyle that accompanies. Then that love ought to motivate you to live a certain kind of way. Isn't that interesting? So lip service isn't really what he's looking for. He's looking for obedience. And many people say they love God, but Jesus says if you really do, you'll keep his commandments. That love will motivate you to do that. Question for you tonight, do you really love God? I can't answer that for you. That's like a soul searcher right there. But let's get back to James chapter 1, now verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. Well, let's pause there for a second. That's a lot of good information, isn't it? When we talk about, well, where does this temptation really come from? It's very clear that the temptation itself does not come from God. You're not being tempted by God. Now, the Bible talks about testings. We can go through seasons where God's testing us and our faith is tested and refined, and he certainly allows those things to happen. But the temptation itself is not from God. We're not tempted directly by God. He's not dangling this in front of your face. Now, there is another entity that is involved in temptation. Jesus instructs his disciples specifically to pray concerning that. He says, pray, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Because the evil one is directly associated with your temptation. And James 1:13 is clear that God is not. So don't let that thought into your mind. And then it goes on and just gives us some additional facts to say that God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. And then it says, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Boy, that's pretty destructive. And the seed of the whole thing is temptation. Listen to what that says. Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires. Where does temptation come from? Within us. It comes from within us. And we deal with this very practically speaking when we talk about triggers. Triggers tend to be these external things that tempt us, cause that cycle to begin in our minds, that make us want to use again. But there has to be a desire already within us in order for a temptation to be a temptation. Let's say, Just imagine a world where you hate chocolate, okay? Which I know is hard for some, it's hard for some of you to imagine. Just go there with me for a second. In fact, you hate chocolate and you're allergic to it. It makes you sick when you have it. The smell of it, nothing about it. You hate chocolate in this scenario. Now, I don't hate chocolate, but you do. And so if we're both sitting at the table together and somebody comes in and they put all that chocolate in front of you and there's my favorite candy bar and there's, a fudge sundae or whatever it may be. If you hate chocolate, is that a temptation for you? No, it's not. You're like, ugh, get that out of here. It's disgusting. I hate chocolate. It's going to make me sick. Get it out of here, right? It can't tempt you. But it can tempt me. And that's sort of how triggers work, and that's how temptations work. But there has to be a desire for it within you in order for it to be a temptation. Now, we could have a whole discussion about those desires and say, where does that come from? And how come this person has a desire to this thing? And if I get 100% biblical with it, we're born with a sinful nature. We're born with some built-in defects. We're born with a nature that naturally gravitates towards things the Bible calls sinful. And these things are destructive to us. And in many instances, even our society today acknowledges that they're destructive things. But we try to justify it in a whole heap of different ways. But notice that the desire gives birth to sin. Being tempted itself is not a sin. I have to highlight that. If you never got tempted, you wouldn't be human. That's just part of the package deal. You're going to face temptation, and that in and of itself is not a sin, but there's a fine line right there. Because something as simple as just entertaining that temptation too long could give birth to sin. And you haven't even done anything yet. But in your mind, in your heart, you have. And that's sort of the way Jesus breaks it down in the Sermon on the Mount. So it's pretty serious stuff. And those verses answer a lot of questions about temptation, but there's more. I fell into the trap, and I'll share this with you guys in case anybody else has fallen into this trap, but I fell into the trap for a while of just accepting the fact that we're going to be tempted. You just go, all right, well, we are human. We're all going to be tempted. I have these desires. I have impulses. I face these different temptations. The pull is strong. And you know what? And I'm just thinking to myself, we just have to grit and bear it. We just got to sort of white knuckle through all the temptations, and suffer our way through those different things. And to an extent, that's true. But I was reminded of another verse that brought me hope. And I hope that it does the same for you. Galatians 5, verse 24, it says, and those who are Christ's, those who belong to Jesus, have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Oh, I really like that. Because that means there's something that I can kill. I can kill those desires. I can kill those passions. I can get rid of it. Wouldn't that be amazing? Have you ever thought that to yourself? It says, I don't even want to go there in my mind. I want to rid myself entirely of that desire. But, to me, that is like the picture of freedom. Now, that's a process. I don't think that always happens overnight, although sometimes it does. But just to believe that it's possible to get to the place where you hate the things you used to love. And sometimes it's a realization of what it does to you, what it does to your life, what it does to your friends and family, what it does to the heart of God when we live in rebellion against Him. And as we start to realize those things, all of a sudden those temptations, there's this knowing that's like, I don't want that anymore. And there might be times where I'm pulled towards it, but I don't really, in my heart of hearts, I don't want that anymore. The Bible talks about taking every thought captive and making it obedient to Christ. And I think that's part of this journey of really crucifying not only the deed, but the desire. And I don't know about you, but that really gives me hope. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 says that no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. There's a lot of information in that verse, too, about temptation and how this all works. First thing it says is, no temptation has overtaken you except that which is common to man. One of the great lies that the tempter uses, that the evil one uses, is that you're the only one going through what you're going through. No one else in the whole wide world could ever possibly understand what it is you're going through. That is a lie from the pit of hell. And I just want to tell you that as, I hope I got my point across. But it is. It really is. Because in a lot of ways, people are the same. And what an isolating lie that is. To think that you're the only one. Well, first of all, you're not that special, and neither am I. So we got to get over that, and I know that's hard for us in the West to understand that, but we're not that special, okay? And we are to God, but not in that way. Everybody suffers. Everybody endures temptations. And they may come in different shapes and sizes. And sometimes I will hear people say, well, I don't understand alcoholics. I can't relate to that at all. I can't relate to that at all. You're not being honest with yourself. You're not being honest with yourself. You are not looking at who you really are and being transparent about your own struggles, because there is something that has gripped you so tightly. There is something that the Bible defines as sin that has gripped you so tightly that you are in complete and total slavery to it. 100% without exception. And that puts us all in the same boat. It puts us all in the same boat. So maybe we're not being imaginative enough, or maybe we're looking down on somebody else's struggle and saying, well, mine's not so bad. And unfortunately, a lot of people do that. But we're not going to do that here. We're not going to do that. And by the way, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. So if we can break that mentality, if we start to understand, we're in a room full of people who share many of the same struggles. And when you leave, you're going to encounter people who share many of the same struggles. I've had the benefit of being a pastor for over 10 years. And it comes with some challenges. And you hear a lot of people's stories. And I've also worked in the recovery field for over a decade now as well. And I've done many intakes. I think I did over 300 intakes during my time at Frontline. So I got to hear a lot of people's stories. And the stories of the people that would come through for an intake and the stories of the people that I know in the church are no different. None at all. Some people are better at keeping secrets. It's maybe not on public record. But the struggles are all the same. The temptation's all the same. It's all there. It's humanity. It's the ugliness of humanity, but we all have to deal with it. And I believe Christ is the solution, and a relationship with God is where freedom can be found. And so it says, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will also make the way of escape. There's your hope, okay? You're going to be tempted, but there's a way out, that you may be able to bear it. Now, I have to say that this is one of the most clumsily misquoted verses maybe in the entire Bible, is this one right here. Have you ever heard somebody say, well, God will never give you more than you can handle? You ever heard somebody say that? Yeah, that's not in the Bible, folks. That is not what this verse says. It's not what it says. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say, you got more than you can handle right now. Okay? Anybody got more than they can handle right now? That is not what this verse says. What it says is, temptations will come. But if you're looking to the Lord for help, He's going to make a way out for you. He's not going to allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able to bear. There is no mission impossible. And many times, if we're honest with ourselves and we look at our recovery and we can look at our relapse history and we can go, you know what, I veered off back here. We can see so many exit ramps in that decision-making process that if we go back and say, man, I could have got out here, I could have got out there, this person confronted me, this person tried to talk to me, so-and-so invited me to this meeting, and I passed until I used. And the reality is that's usually how it works. We can usually look back in hindsight and see all the ways of escape there were, and we just said no. Pedal to the metal. Well, God promises to give you a way out. And we have to choose to take that way out. Temptation is common. Everyone has to deal with it. It says that God will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. Now, this was written to believers. It was written to people who had already given their lives and put their trust and faith in God. But I believe this is true for anybody who's willing to cry out to God for help. Like if you're willing to look up to him, if you're willing to say, all right, God, I'm not pulling this off. I need your help. Will you help me on this journey? Will you show me the way out next time? Then this promise is for you. And we find a little more encouragement in the book of Jude. One of my favorite verses in regard to struggling with sin, struggling with recovery. You ever just get down on yourself? You ever just say, man, I'm never going to pull this off. You know, you ever think to yourself like, I'm a lost cause. I make the same mistakes, and no matter what I seem to do, I can get on the right track for a while, and then I blow it, and something else happens. Jude 1:24. It says, now to him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy. Now, does it say that you're able to keep yourself from falling, from stumbling, from tripping up, from falling? No, it doesn't say that. It says to him who is able to keep us from stumbling and to present us faultless. It's like God can order your steps. Like God can keep you from falling. Wow. Cling to that one in your prayer time. All right, God, you said you're able to keep me from tripping up. You're able to present me faultless to stand before you one day. Lord, help me do that. Keep me today. Keep my mind and my eyes on you. The promise is that with God, it's actually possible for you to fight the battle against temptation and win. I like that. God desires to release his power into our lives when we submit ourselves to him in repentance and come to him for help. The scriptures teach us how his strength will work in our weaknesses. And in my experience, it is so true. It is so true. And an important truth for us to understand, if we want to fight and we want to win, is that Jesus was God, but in the flesh. And that is to understand that he put on humanity, that he stepped into our shoes. We always say, you know, like, you haven't been in my shoes. Jesus stepped into your shoes. The Bible's very clear about this. And he was subjected to temptations, just like we are. And it's recorded. It's in the Bible. It talks about what he did and how he responded to it and how that helps him to relate to us. And now Jesus is our mediator. He's our sacrifice. He's the one that fixes our sin problem. Not only with our nature, with our past sins and everything moving forward. And in Hebrews 2:17, it talks about him, and it says, therefore, in all things, he had to be made like his brethren. So it was important for Jesus to be made like us, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are being tempted. That's encouraging. So because he stepped into your shoes, because he endured the temptation, because he suffered like maybe you're suffering, He's able to aid those who are being tempted. Now, I want to look at a passage that we refer to as the temptation of Christ. And we're going to look at this briefly. This isn't going to be in depth. We're going to keep this relatively short. But it really exemplifies how to win and just how spiritual temptation can really be. In Matthew chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to